Hello, good afternoon. I'm Dr. Moli Nondi, one of the mentors at Study MRCOG, and today I will be teaching you about the module of SRH, that's Sexual and Reproductive Health, and I have made 15 SBAs and 15 EMQs, and we'll be discussing the explanation. They are very high-yield questions for your MRCOG Part 2 examination, and I hope that this session will be very helpful for all of you. Now, before we begin the session, one very important quote for the day that success occurs when your dreams get bigger than your excuses. And I am very positive that all of you who are watching this video will definitely achieve your goals and you're working so hard, and I wish the best for all of you. So the topic that we'll be covering today in the session includes emergency contraceptions, UKMEC categories, scenarios, BASH guidelines, important sexually transmitted infections. First question is a SBA. With regards to human papilloma virus and screening program, which of the following statements is true? Option A, 10% of women develop serum antibodies to HPV. Option B, cervical cancers associated with HPV genotype 6 and 11. C, HPV is the cause of 50% of all cancers. Regular screening prevents 75% of cancers. The majority of HPV is symptomatic, causing warts. So the question asked is what is true? Please note this before you start proceeding and seeing the options, because sometimes they ask all are true except, sometimes they ask what is false. So this should not be an error. The answer for this question is D. Regular screening prevents about 75% of cancers. The answer is regular screening prevents 75% of cancers. Type 6 and 11 are the low risk genotypes, as you all must be knowing that it causes genital warts. HPV is the cause of 3.7% of all cancers. Approximately 50% of women develop antibodies. And the last statement is not true. Most HPV are asymptomatic. A 28-year-old woman attends a family planning clinic for contraception. Advice: she has been tested positive for BRCA1 gene. She has blood pressure 140/92 at her last visit with GP. The following are true regarding contraceptive use for her, except which one? So that means which of these options is false? A, she can be advised that there may be an additional risk of breast cancer with COC use. She can be advised that there's a reduction in the risk of colorectal cancer with COC use. In view of her being BRCA1 carrier, her risk of ovarian cancer increases 30% with COC use. She can be advised that COC use provides a protective effect against the against endometrial cancer that continues for 15 years or more after stopping COC. Hypertension may increase the risk of stroke and MI in those using COC. The answer is C. In view of her being BRCA gene carrier, her risk of ovarian cancer increased by 30% with COC use. This is not a true statement. For women who are at high risk of developing ovarian cancer, such as those who are BRCA1 and BRCA2 gene carriers, studies suggest that this risk can be reduced by 60% by using COC pills and not increased. Also, a progesterone-only pill may confer an even greater level of protection. Combined oral contraceptive pill use risks and benefits. Women can be advised that CHC use in perimenopause may help to maintain their bone mineral density. It may reduce menstrual pain and bleeding. Women can be advised that in clinical practice, CHC may reduce menopausal symptoms. Women experiencing menopausal symptoms while using CHC may try an extended regimen. They can be advised that there may be reduction in the incidence of benign breast disease with CHC use. They can be advised that there's a reduction in the risk of colorectal cancer with CHC use. Women can be advised that CHC use provides a protective effect against ovarian endometrial cancer that continues for 15 years or more after stopping CHC. Women can be advised that there may be a small additional risk of breast cancer with CHC use, which reduces to no risk 10 years after stopping CHC use. Women who are aged 35 years or over and smoke should be advised the risk of CHC usually outweighs the benefits. Clinicians should be aware that there may be a very small increased risk of ischemic stroke with CHC use. Women with cardiovascular disease, stroke, or migraine with aura should be advised against using the use of CHC. Practitioners who are prescribing CHC to women aged over 40 years may wish to consider a pill with less than 30 micrograms of ethinyl estradiol as a suitable first choice. Hypertension may increase the risk of stroke and MI in those using CHC. Blood pressure should be checked before and at least 6 months after initiating a woman aged over 40 years on CHC and monitored at least annually thereafter. So you may get questions on any of these following points that I've discussed, and it can be a very high yield topic. The next question, a 26-year-old woman, para 1, chooses to have LNG IUS as method of contraception. She has been using other forms of contraception. In which of the following scenarios mentioned below will this woman need the use of extra protection, that is, condom or abstinence, for 7 days after insertion? The option A is if the woman is within 12 weeks since the last progestogen only injection, if the woman is within 3 years of insertion of a subdermal implant, if the woman is no later than day 1 of hormone-free interval for pills or patch, if the woman is within 7 days post-abortion or miscarriage, or if she is partially breastfeeding, amenorrheic, and less than 3 months postpartum. This question tests your knowledge that a patient with LNG IUS needs 7 days of additional contraception if does not have any ongoing contraception. So we must know which of the ongoing contraceptive methods that she is using is an effective one. Answer is E. If the woman is partially breastfeeding, amenorrheic, and less than 3 months postpartum. Note, following insertion of LNG IUS, the woman will not need extra protection if her previous contraceptive method is still active. A very, very pertinent point. Timing of insertion of copper IUD or LNG IUS. A provider can be reasonably certain a woman is not pregnant if she has no signs or symptoms of pregnancy and meets any of the following criteria: has not had intercourse since last normal menses, has been correctly and consistently using a reliable method of contraception, is within the first 7 days after normal menstrual period, post-abortion or miscarriage, she is fully or nearly fully breastfeeding, amenorrheic, and less than 6 months postpartum and not 3 months as it was stated in the question. For LNG IUS, you may need an additional 7 days of contraception if she's not on effective contraception. Copper IUD is effective immediately. Next question. A 14-year-old girl was having a suction termination of pregnancy. She did not want her mother to know. Her mother asks you about why her daughter is in the hospital. The options in the girl's case include which of the following except: disclose to the mother, speak to the patient about disclosure, encourage patient to disclose to mother, advise safe sex practice to the patient, advise reliable contraception to the patient. So which of the following which should you not do? The answer is 4, that is disclose to the mother. A. Gillick competence or Fraser guidelines. Children under the age of 16 may have the capacity to consent to treatment if the patient first understands the information, digests, that is, comprehends the information, and is able to make a decision with the information provided, though they cannot refuse treatment. However, they should be encouraged to inform parents, but they cannot be forced to do so. This information cannot be disclosed to the parents unless the patient agrees. This is a very important point. First, we have to see from the question that if the patient is Gillick competent, then we have to respect the patient choice. And if she doesn't want to disclose, we cannot do that. But definitely we can encourage. Now, how do we assess the Gillick competence? There is no set defined questions to assess it. Professionals need to consider several things before assessing: the child's age, maturity, and mental capacity, their understanding of the issue and what it involves, including advantages, disadvantages, and potential long-term impact, their understanding of the risk, implication, and consequences that may arise from their decision, how well they understand that information at that given point, and whether and we have to remember that consent is not valid if a person is being pressured or influenced by someone else. So please look for these key pointers in the question. A couple has come to your clinic requesting sterilization. After going through the risks and benefits of the procedure, they opt for vasectomy. Which of the following should not be taken into consideration during vasectomy? That means which of the options is false? A. 12 weeks post vasectomy is considered an optimal timing for scheduling the post vasectomy semen analysis. B. Clips are not recommended for occlusion of vas deferens as it is associated with a high failure rate. C. If motile sperms are found in fresh semen sample 3 months post procedure, the vasectomy is considered to be a failure. D. Routine histological examination of vas deferens is no longer recommended. Warming local anesthetic body injections to body temperature before infiltration reduces the pain due to the injection. The answer is C. If motile sperms are found in a fresh sample 3 months post procedure, the vasectomy is considered a failure. That is because it is considered a failure if only after 7 months, you can see the last line, that 7 months post vasectomy, the procedure is considered a failure if there is fresh semen in the post vasectomy semen sample. The next question, a woman is treated for uncomplicated gonorrhea. She asks when she can safely resume sexual intercourse. What advice should be given? A. Resume after 48 hours. B. Resume immediately once the symptoms have resolved. C. Abstain for 7 days after treatment and partner treatment. D. Abstain for 14 days regardless of partner treatment. The correct answer for this question is that the woman should abstain 7 days after treatment and partner treatment. Patient should abstain for sexual intercourse until 7 days after completion of treatment and until all sexual partners have been treated to prevent reinfection and onward transmission. The next question, a 33-year-old man attends following receptive anal and oral intercourse without condoms. He is asymptomatic but requests post-exposure STI prevention. Which counseling point is most appropriate based on current evidence for post-exposure prophylaxis? A. Offer doxycycline post-exposure prophylaxis after unprotected intercourse for chlamydia and syphilis risk reduction. Prescribe azithromycin single dose immediately after unprotected sex. Recommend ciprofloxacin to prevent bacterial STIs. Advise no prophylaxis and to only test if the symptoms develop. The correct answer is offer doxycycline post-exposure prophylaxis after unprotected intercourse for chlamydia and syphilis risk reduction. This is based on the recent updated guideline that doxycycline PEP is supported by UK guidance as an STI prevention in selected higher risk population for chlamydia and syphilis used alongside condoms and testing. The recommended dosing regimen, which BASH recommends, is taking a single dose 200 milligrams, that is 200 milligrams capsule of doxycycline within 24 hours and no later than 72 hours after unprotected sexual intercourse. Moving on to the next question. A 31-year-old woman at 22 weeks of gestation is identified through partner notification as having pharyngeal gonorrhea confirmed on nucleic acid amplification test. She is asymptomatic, has no drug allergies, and this is her first STI diagnosis. Local resistance data show low but presence of cephalosporin MIC creep. This is the minimum inhibitory concentration. What is the most appropriate management strategy? Before we begin the question, we must know what does exactly a low MIC mean. That means a low amount of drug is required to kill that organism. That means lower dose is effective and the drug is effective for that organism. A. Oral cefixime single dose with repeat NAT at 6 weeks. Intramuscular ceftriaxone 1 gram single dose without further testing. Option C, same but with test of cure after 7 days. Option D, intramuscular ceftriaxone 1 gram single dose with test of cure after 14 days. Or last option E, with defer treatment until postpartum and repeat NAT in the 3rd trimester. We have to understand from this question that STIs like this have to be treated in pregnancy, and we need to know what the correct drug and the safe drug is. The correct option is D, intramuscular ceftriaxone 1 gram single dose with the test of cure after 14 days. Pharyngeal infection has the highest treatment failure rate of all gonococcal sites. Pregnancy does not alter treatment choice but does heighten the importance of microbiological clearance, and hence we need to do the test of cure. It is mandatory for pharyngeal gonorrhea, the test of cure, irrespective of pregnancy or symptoms, typically more than 14 days post-treatment using NAT. A 29-year-old primigravida, presents at 30 plus 4 weeks of gestation with her first episode of painful vulval ulceration and dysuria. The HSV PCR from the lesion is positive for HSV2. The serology shows HSV2 IgG negative and HSV1 IgG positive. She completes a 7-day course of oral acyclovir with complete lesion resolution. She has no risk factors for preterm birth. What is the most appropriate ongoing management plan? Option A, no further antiviral therapy and we aim for vaginal delivery if no lesions at labor. Option B, suppressive acyclovir from 36 weeks with planned vaginal delivery. Option C, suppressive acyclovir from 32 weeks with planned vaginal delivery. Option D, suppressive therapy from 32 weeks with planned C-section. Option E, elective cesarean section without any suppressive antiviral therapy. The correct answer is suppressive acyclovir from 32 weeks with planned vaginal delivery. So I have explained why this is the correct answer in a stepwise manner. So kindly pay attention to this. This question tests classification of HSV infection, timing of acquisition, and delivery planning as per the 2024 algorithm. Step 1, classify the infection. She is HSV IgG negative, so this is the first episode of HSV2 infection. However, she is HSV IgG positive, meaning this is a non-primary first episode, not a true primary infection. A true primary infection will have both HSV1 and 2 IgG negative. This distinction is critical as neonatal risk is lower than primary infection but higher than recurrent disease. Now, step 2 is the time of acquisition. Infection occurs in the third trimester, more than 28 weeks. This places the patient in a higher risk category for viral shedding at delivery, but not the highest risk group, which is the true primary infection. Step 3, the antiviral strategy. For first episode of HSV in third trimester, the algorithm recommends suppressive acyclovir from 32 weeks of gestation. So that is the first episode of HSV2, so we will give acyclovir. We do not need to initiate it earlier, and also in this question does not mandate that, but just for the information, earlier initiation is reserved, that is from 22 weeks, for those who are at high risk of preterm birth. Last step is deciding the mode of delivery. Caesarean section is reserved for true primary infection acquired late in pregnancy. In non-primary first episode infection, vaginal delivery is appropriate, provided there is no lesions or prodromal symptoms at the time of labor. The next question, a 27-year-old primigravida presents at 35 plus 6 weeks of gestation with painful vulval ulceration, dysuria, and systemic symptoms. HSV2 PCR from the lesion is positive. Serology shows both HSV1 and HSV2 IgG negative. So this is a true primary infection. After 7 days of acyclovir, lesions resolve completely by 37 plus 2 weeks. What is the most appropriate delivery plan? So as we discussed previously, we have to use those principles in this question as well. A, vaginal delivery if lesions have resolved. B, vaginal delivery if suppressive acyclovir until labor. Cesarean section only if lesion recur at labor. Planned C-section regardless of lesion status, or assisted vaginal delivery to minimize the duration of the labor. The correct answer is a planned cesarean section regardless of the lesion status. This is a very important algorithm given in the guidelines of herpes in pregnancy. If there is recurrent herpes or diagnosis of genital herpes prior to pregnancy, treat recurrences with standard dose of acyclovir if necessary. If there is primary acquisition of genital herpes in the first or second trimester, treat the primary episode with the same standard dose. Consider acyclovir 400 mg TDS from 32 weeks of gestation or from 22 weeks for those at higher risk of premature delivery and offer vaginal delivery. Primary acquisition of genital herpes in the third trimester, treat primary episode with standard doses. Consider acyclovir until delivery. Recommend planned C-section, especially if within 6 weeks of delivery, like it was in the last question. Moving on to the next question. A 20-year-old woman presents 4 days after a single episode of unprotected sexual intercourse. She is 3 months postnatal, not breastfeeding, has a BMI of 34, and not using any regular contraception. Her menstrual cycles are regular, and she believes she is around mid-cycle. A pregnancy test today is negative. She wishes to have the most effective method of emergency contraception, which is the best option. Levonorgestrel 1.5 milligram, ulipristal acetate 30 milligram as single doses, copper IUD, double dose levonorgestrel, ulipristal acetate followed by immediate start of COC. The answer to this question is copper intrauterine device insertion. This method tests method effectiveness, timing, BMI consideration, and mechanism of action, all core elements of the FSRH emergency contraception guidelines. The key points are the copper IUD is the most effective form of emergency contraception with a failure rate of less than 0.1%. It is more effective than the oral methods, regardless of timing when the emergency contraception window. A copper IUD can be inserted up to 120 hours after unprotected sexual intercourse or up to 5 days after the earliest likely date of ovulation. After 96 hours post intercourse, the copper IUD remains fully effective. BMI. Increased BMI may reduce the effectiveness of oral emergency contraception, particularly levonorgestrel. The effectiveness of copper IUD is not affected by height, weight, or BMI. Mechanism. Oral emergency contraception works mainly by delaying ovulation. The copper IUD works primarily by preventing fertilization and implantation, making it effective even if ovulation has occurred. A nulliparous woman who presents at her local sexual reproductive health clinic having had unprotected sexual intercourse on day 16 of a regular 28-day cycle. She's in a new relationship having had intercourse last night with her boyfriend who she met at a party a few weeks ago. She's keen for a method of contraception. She has not had any episodes of unprotected intercourse in this cycle. She suffers from epilepsy and takes carbamazepine twice daily. She's otherwise well and has no personal or family history. Examination shows that her height is 159, weight 58 kg, blood pressure is normal. Which of the following is the single most appropriate management? Advice regarding STI and condom use and follow-up treatment, appointment to discuss female or male sterilization. Option B, 1500 milligram of levonorgestrel and quick start DMPA, 3000 milligram of levonorgestrel and quick start POP, 30 milligram of ulipristal acetate and start DMPA after 5 days, or 30 milligram of ulipristal acetate and start POP after 5 days. The correct answer is 30 milligram of ulipristal acetate and start DMPA after 5 days. Ulipristal acetate is the preferred choice due to potential drug interaction between levonorgestrel and carbamazepine. UPA can interact with other hormonal contraceptive and therefore DMPA initiation should be delayed for 5 days. So this is a very, very important algorithm that is given in the FSRH guidelines of emergency contraception. I'll just brief it out and you can read it later, but please keep it in your list of last minute notes revision so that you need to revise this in your last minute before attempting the exam. Currently, it's less than 120 hours since the last UPSI. Yes. Additional UPSI in this cycle more than 120 hours ago? Yes or unknown? Currently within 5 days of the earliest likely date of ovulation? If yes, offer copper IUD. If not acceptable, offer oral emergency contraception and suitable ongoing contraception. If she has not had any additional UPSI in this cycle more than 120 hours ago, offer copper IUD. If not acceptable, then oral. If we do not know that if she is within the first 5 days of the date of ovulation, then consider a pregnancy test if unprotected sexual intercourse this cycle more than 21 days ago. Offer oral emergency contraception and suitable ongoing contraception. If she has had UPSI not within 120 hours but prior to that, but currently within 5 days after her earliest likely date of ovulation, then offer her copper IUD. Oral emergency contraception is unlikely to be effective. Offers suitable quick start contraception if she doesn't want to continue keeping the copper IUD. It's not known. Offer emergency contraception oral, unlikely to be effective, so we have to counsel the patient accordingly. Offer suitable quick start contraception. If there is no status about the duration when she has had the previous sexual intercourse, we do not know, patient is unable to tell us the exact timing, but we know that she's currently within first 5 days of the earliest likely date of ovulation, then offer her copper IUD. If not acceptable, then offer her oral emergency contraception. If we do not know about her ovulation status also, then offer her oral emergency contraception and suitable ongoing contraception and do counsel the patient accordingly. The copper IUD is the most effective form of emergency contraception. If the criteria for insertion of a copper IUD are not met or a copper IUD is not acceptable to a woman, consider oral emergency contraception. Last UPSI less than 96 hours ago, yes. UPSI is likely to have taken place within 5 days prior to the estimated date of ovulation. If the answer to that is yes, then note that oral emergency contraception is unlikely to be effective after ovulation. So, first choice is ulipristal acetate plus start contraception after 5 days. Second option, reconsider copper IUD if all UPSI within 120 hours or if currently within 5 days of after likely ovulation. If ulipristal acetate not suitable, then LNG, emergency contraception plus immediate quick start. If she is not in the first 5 days of estimated of ovulation, BMI more than 26, weight more than 70. If the answer to that is yes, the first option is ulipristal acetate and the second option is double dose LNG. If the answer to that is no, then LNG is the first choice and ulipristal acetate can also be given. If her last unprotected sexual intercourse is not within 96 hours or we have no idea when she had it, but it is certain that it is within 120 hours, then we can give a ulipristal acetate or LNG-IUS. If we are not sure when she had the last unprotected intercourse at all, oral emergency contraception is unlikely to be effective. Reconsider copper IUD if currently within 5 days after their likely ovulation or immediately quick start only. Next question. A 35-year-old para 1+1 has undergone recent surgical management of miscarriage following a confirmed molar pregnancy. Her HCG levels are being monitored and are still significantly elevated. She continues to experience irregular vaginal bleeding following recent uterine evacuation procedure. On examination, height 156 centimeter, weight 58 BMI is normal. Blood pressure 110/65. She's in a long-term relationship and needs contraception. Which method of contraception is most suitable for her? So there are some key points to be considered here, that she's undergone surgical management for molar, she still has ongoing bleeding, and the beta HCG has not come down. The options include diaphragm, copper IUD, female sterilization, fertility awareness methods, or male condoms. The correct answer is E, male condoms. It's safe during ongoing HCG monitoring, has no effect on bleeding or HCG interpretation, immediately effective and fully reversible, avoids uterine instrumentation during GTD follow-up, which is a UK MEC4. We can't put a copper IUD in if the beta HCG is up and she's ongoing treatment for molar pregnancy. Barrier methods are appropriate at all stages of molar pregnancy is a point to be noted here. Why options are incorrect? Female sterilization, permanent and inappropriate. Diaphragm incorrect, lower efficacy and unreliable in these presence of ongoing irregular vaginal bleeding. Copper IUD incorrect, contraindicated until HCG normalizes due to increased risk of bleeding and infection post-molar evacuation. Fertility awareness is also incorrect, unreliable due to disrupted ovulation and irregular bleeding. Pregnancy must be strictly avoided during surveillance. So if any of these options are mentioned in your question, then they will not be correct. So please note that if these options are present, then why they are not correct as well. So we must know the reason behind it. The next question, a 26-year-old para 1 comes to your clinic requesting contraception. She mentions that her maternal aunt had developed DVT and is on warfarin. She's worried that if she takes hormonal contraception, she will also develop DVT, which is a very good point that she's brought up. Which of the following advice regarding DVT is incorrect? First, COC containing a third generation progestogen is associated with an increased risk of venous thromboembolism when compared with those containing second generation progestogens. The risk of VTE increases with the number of years of usage of a COC. Option 3, there's a little or no data to suggest an increased risk of VTE with oral or injectable progestogen only contraceptives. Thrombophilia screening not routinely recommended before the use of combined hormonal contraceptive. So in the question, please note they're asking which of the option is wrong, incorrect. The answer to this is B. The risk of VT increases with the number of years of usage of a combined hormonal pill. The correct answer is that the risk of VT increases with the number of years of usage of a combined hormonal pill. The risk of VT is highest in the first 4 months following initiation of a CHC or when restarting after a break of 1 month. The risk then reduces over the next year and remains stable thereafter. So it does not keep on going increasing, it gets stabilized. Although the risk is very high in the first few months of CHC use and then falls, it remains higher than in non-users. While women with reduced level of naturally occurring anticoagulants like antithrombin 3, protein C, S, factor 5 laden, or prothrombin gene mutation are predisposed to VTE, FSRH guidance does not recommend the routine need for screening of thrombophilia prior to the use of CHC, as a negative screen may exclude all types of thrombophilia may not exclude all types of thrombophilia. The last question in the SBA category, you are going to prescribe a common hormonal contraception for a 15-year-old girl. She has cerebral palsy and becomes very distressed with her periods. Which method and regimen would be the best option for her? First, patch 3 weeks of use and 1 week of break. Second, patch 6 weeks of use and 1 week of break. Last is patch continuous until bleeding, 1 week of break. Then the options of pills, 9 weeks of pills, 2 weeks of break, or pills continuously until bleeding starts and then 2 weeks of break. The correct answer for this question is patch continuous until bleeding, 1 week break. We have to take into consideration that she has cerebral palsy and may have reduced understanding and compliance with pills. The patches are changed weekly. However, the same effect as continuous oral contraceptive pill can be achieved by applying patches serially for 9 weeks, followed by a 7-day withdrawal period, or used continuously until breakthrough bleeding occurs. For girls with low body weight or those on enzyme inducers, enzyme inhibiting anti-epileptic drugs, the patches can be divided to reduce the dose and tailor to the need of the patient. Now, moving on to the EMQs, I have given EMQs in all the sections of STIs, emergency contraception, and the Fraser guidelines, Gillick competence, and all the questions we have about mental capacity and all of that. So this will be a good revision for all of you. Please remember to read all the explanation because new questions can be generated out of them. We always do not get repeat questions, so we should understand the reason and the science behind the options as well. Going through the options of emergency contraception, option A, LNG 1.5 milligram, option B, LNG double dose 3 milligram, C is ulipristal acetate 30 milligram, D is copper IUD, E is no emergency contraception needed. Last is urine pregnancy test after 3 weeks. Moving on to the questions of EMQ. A 23-year-old woman presents to a sexual assault referral clinic 24 hours after sexual assault. She had her last menstrual period 9 days ago and has regular 28-day cycles. She has already been started on HIV post-exposure prophylaxis. She is medically fit, has no contraindications to hormonal contraception, and declines any intrauterine method. She now requests emergency contraception. So what will be the correct answer to this? Correct answer is ulipristal acetate 30 milligram. The key points to be considered is timing, that is 24 hours after assault, emergency contraception is indicated. She's on day 9, approaching the fertile window. The HIV post-exposure prophylaxis that is recommended in UK does not comprise of any enzyme inducers or inhibitors, so therefore the oral contraceptives can be given, and it is also not a contraindication to emergency contraception. If the patient declines copper IUD, then oral emergency contraception is recommended. According to FSRH, UPA, that is ulipristal acetate, is the first line oral emergency contraception. It is more effective than levonorgestrel, particularly when close to ovulation in the early mid-follicular phase. Can be used up to 120 hours after unprotected sexual intercourse. No significant interaction with the standard HIV post-exposure prophylaxis regimens. In sexual assault cases, FSRH advises offering the most effective emergency contraception available, particularly when pregnancy risk is significant. Next question. A 29-year-old woman presents requesting emergency contraception. She had unprotected sexual intercourse day 12 and also had unprotected intercourse 6 days prior to that, that is day 6 of a regular 30-day menstrual cycle. She's otherwise fit and well, takes no regular medications, and not using any ongoing contraception. The correct answer is D, copper intrauterine device. She has had 2 episodes of UPSI in the same cycle, day 6 and day 12, likely periovulatory on the day 12. Risk requires a method effective on all UPSI episodes. Why copper IUD is correct? According to FSRH, number one, copper IUD is the most effective emergency contraception, which I have constantly reiterated. It is the only method effective after ovulation. It is effective when inserted up to 120 hours after UPSI or up to 5 days after the earliest estimated date of ovulation. Importantly, it is only method that protects against multiple UPSI episodes within the same cycle. Oral emergency contraception works by delaying ovulation. It cannot cover earlier UPSI once ovulation is imminent or has occurred. The next question, a 34-year-old woman presents to a community sexual and reproductive health clinic 98 hours after unprotected sexual intercourse. She has a BMI of 37, regular menstrual cycles, and no significant past history. She's not using any contraception and does not wish to have an intrauterine device inserted. Answer to this is ulipristal acetate. She's presenting at 98 hours after UPSI. Her BMI is more than 30 and she's declining copper IUD or any form of IUD. Why this option is correct? As I've stated before, ulipristal acetate is effective up to 120 hours of unprotected intercourse. Now the option comes between choosing between ulipristal acetate and LNG. Ulipristal acetate has been demonstrated to be more effective than LNG from 0 to 120 hours of UPSI. It is important to bear in mind that the evidence suggests that both UPA and LNG are ineffective if taken after ovulation. Between 96 to 120 hours after UPSI, the evidence suggests that LNG is ineffective if taken more than 96 hours after UPSI. Ulipristal acetate is therefore the only emergency contraception that is likely to be effective if unprotected sexual intercourse took place between 96 to 120 hours. Hence, this is the correct answer. The next question, a 31-year-old woman attends a sexual and reproductive health clinic requesting emergency contraception. She had unprotected sexual intercourse 36 hours ago. Her last menstrual period was 11 days ago and she has regular 28-day cycles. She has epilepsy well controlled on carbamazepine and gives history of allergic reaction to LR1 taken earlier. She is otherwise well and declines intrauterine method of contraception. So LR1 is ulipristal acetate and we must know this. So the correct answer is LNG emergency contraception 3 milligram. So in the background of a patient using enzyme-inducing drugs, the effectiveness of both ulipristal acetate and LNG could be reduced if a woman is an enzyme inducer. It is not known whether either method is effective in pregnancy in this situation. It is recommended that double dose LNG can be used, but effectiveness and how this compares with ulipristal acetate is unknown. Use of double dose ulipristal acetate is not currently recommended. A 28-year-old woman presents to a sexual and reproductive health clinic requesting emergency contraception. She had unprotected sexual intercourse 48 hours ago. Her last menstrual period was 10 days ago and she had regular 28-day cycles. She has severe asthma requiring oral prednisolone 20 milligrams twice daily and is currently undergoing treatment for acute PID. She's otherwise well and not using any ongoing contraception. So the points to be considered in this question is that she had intercourse 48 hours ago, that is within 120 hours. Her last menstrual period was 10 days ago on a regular 28-day cycle. So it is likely that she has not ovulated or within the first 5 days of ovulation. She has severe asthma. This is a very important point to be noted. And also another condition for which she is taking treatment is PID. So the best option in this case would be levonorgestrel 1.5 milligram. The discriminating factors is that she is 48 hours after UPSI, so therefore definitely we have to give her something. Severe asthma on systemic corticosteroids, active PID. Why levonorgestrel is correct in this question? is that ulipristal acetate is contraindicated in women with severe asthma being treated with systemic glucocorticoids. Please remember this point because ulipristal acetate has anti-glucocorticoid activity which might reduce steroid efficacy. Next option is copper IUD, is also contraindicated in current pelvic inflammatory disease. It's a UKMEC4 of insertion of copper IUD due to risk of ascending infection. So the best option here is LNG, and we do not need to give a double dose. We can give the recommended dose of 1.5 milligram. It has no interaction with corticosteroids. It's safe in asthma and it's appropriate to be used within 72 hours. Hence, this is the best choice. Now, moving on to the management of the sexually transmitted infections. The options are given. I know there are quite many, but I will come back to them. The first is doxycycline, 100 milligram twice a day for 7 days. The second option is 7 days plus test of cure. Option C is ceftriaxone plus doxycycline. Option D is only ceftriaxone IM. Option E is ceftriaxone 1 gram IM single dose with test of cure. Option F is benzathine penicillin 2.5 IM single dose. Option G is the same benzathine penicillin IM weekly for 3 weeks. Option H is metronidazole 400 milligram twice daily. Acyclovir for 5 days. Empirical treatment of PID with ceftriaxone, doxycycline, metronidazole. Single dose azithromycin followed by 500 milligram once a day for 2 days. Next option L is azithromycin 1 gram single dose followed by 500 milligram daily for 2 days plus test of cure. Option M is intravaginal clindamycin cream once daily for 7 days. And last option is no treatment, just reassurance and safety netting. Moving on to the very important questions. A 21-year-old woman, 18 weeks pregnant, presents with postcoital bleeding and mucopurulent cervicitis. The nucleic acid amplification test done on vulvovaginal swabs confirms chlamydia trachomatis. Points to be considered: she is pregnant and she has a confirmed diagnosis of chlamydia. So the correct answer is option L, that is azithromycin 1 gram single dose followed by 500 milligram once a day for 2 days plus test of cure. So the important point to be noted that doxycycline and ofloxacin are contraindicated in pregnancy. So the recommended regime is azithromycin 1 gram orally as single dose followed by 500 milligram once a daily for 2 days, or erythromycin 500 milligram 4 times a day for 7 days. The very important point is that because she is pregnant, the test of cure is mandatory. Test of cure is not routinely recommended in uncomplicated genital chlamydial infection because residual non-viable chlamydial DNA may be detected by NAT for 3 to 5 weeks following treatment. But test of cure is recommended in pregnancy where poor compliance is suspected and where symptoms persist. Next question. A 23-year-old woman presents with frothy green vaginal discharge in strawberry cervix. So the diagnosis is, yes, you're correct. It's Trichomonas vaginalis. The answer is H, metronidazole 400 milligram twice daily for 7 days. Now, a few key points about Trichomonas vaginalis. 10 to 50% of them are asymptomatic. The symptoms include vaginal discharge, vaginal itching, dysuria, offensive odor, but these are not specific. Occasionally, the presenting complaint is of lower abdominal discomfort or vulval ulceration. Vaginal discharge is present in 70%, varying in consistency from thin to thick, scanty to profuse. Classical frothy yellow discharge is present in 10 to 30% of women. Vulvitis and vaginitis associate with trichomoniasis. Approximately 2% of patients will have the strawberry cervix appearance to naked eye. There has been an SB about this as well. Higher rates are seen on colposcopic examination. 5 to 15% will have no abnormalities on examination. Metronidazole 400 to 500 milligram twice daily for 7 days is the recommended treatment. Next question. A 28-year-old woman presents with symptomatic bacterial vaginosis found on microscopy. She's not pregnant. She gives history of alcoholism, not complying with the de-addiction treatment. The EMQ that you may receive in the question may not have this mentioned in such a straightforward manner. They might give it in the question in a background history of intake of alcohol, drugs, and smoking, and that she is a frequent visit to the club and then she drinks frequently, and at present also she's having ongoing drinks, or she wishes to go to a party where tonight or maybe tomorrow where she wants to drink with her friends. So these are the key pointers which they may mention in the question. But the fact we have to understand is that alcohol can cause disulfiram like reaction if we are giving metronidazole to the patient. So both of them react, and that can be very bad for the patient because it causes disulfiram-like reaction. So first, we have to know the diagnosis, which is bacterial vaginosis, clearly stated. They may not state this. They may give the presenting complaints and the diagnostic features like clue cells. And you must know that in bacterial vaginosis, the treatment recommended is metronidazole. But because this patient is alcoholic and she is on de-addiction treatment but not compliant, that means she is taking alcohol, and we do not know whether she will be able to stop herself for the next 7 days. The correct answer is option M, intravaginal clindamycin cream 2% once daily for 7 days. With metronidazole, as I have stated, treatment alcohol should be avoided because of the possibility of a disulfiram-like reaction. There are no data on the risk from consuming alcohol with intravaginal metronidazole gel, but it is not recommended at present. Clindamycin cream is something we can use, but it can weaken condoms, which should not be used during such treatment. Even in the background of a patient having allergy with metronidazole, clindamycin 2% cream is recommended. The next question, a 27-year-old woman attends a sexual health clinic with intermenstrual bleeding and purulent cervical discharge. She has history of vomiting on taking penicillin. No history of anaphylaxis. The NAT from an endocervical swab is positive for Neisseria gonorrhea. She is not pregnant, no allergies, and has no clinical evidence of PID. The correct option is answer D, that is ceftriaxone 1 gram intramuscular single dose only, which is the recommended dose. Now, the point to be considered here is that in penicillin allergic people, ceftriaxone and cefixime are suitable options unless there is a history of severe hypersensitivity, that is anaphylaxis, to any beta-lactam antibacterial agents, penicillin, cephalosporins, or monobactams or carbapenems. In this question, the patient had only vomiting. She did not have any severe anaphylaxis. So therefore, this treatment can be given. A 24-year-old woman presents to a sexual health clinic with a 5-day history of painful vulval lesions. She reports severe vulval pain, dysuria, and flu-like symptoms. Examination shows multiple tender vesicular lesions with shallow ulcers on an erythematous brace and bilateral tender inguinal lymphadenopathy. This is her first episode of genital symptoms. She is not pregnant and has no significant past medical history. As you can see that from the clinical picture, this is herpes simplex virus. So the correct answer will be I, acyclovir 400 milligram 3 times daily for 5 days. So key considerations are painful vesicles progressing to ulcers. She has dysuria, systemic symptoms, and fever malaise, tender inguinal lymphadenopathy, and first episode usually more severe. According to the BASH guidelines, antiviral therapy should be started as early as possible. First episode should be treated with acyclovir 400 milligram 3 times daily for 5 days. Moving on to the next set of questions. The options are A, the young person is Gillick competent and contraception can be provided without parental consent. Option B, the young patient is not Gillick competent, parental consent is required. C, Fraser guidelines met, contraception can be provided confidentially. D, Fraser guidelines are not met, contraception should not be provided. E, patient has capacity, hence patient's refusal treatment should be respected. F, contraception can be provided only with parental involvement. G, assess Gillick competence but do not apply Fraser guidelines. H, emergency contraception should be withheld until parental consent is obtained. I, proceed with emergency surgery in the best interest of the patient. J, apply to court of protection to authorize treatment. K, disregard the DNA CPR form as patient now lacks capacity and follows the wishes of the lasting power of attorney. L, follow the DNA CPR decision as it represents a valid advance decision made with capacity. M, seek approval from hospital ethics committee before making a decision. So as you can see, these options are very close to each other. So we have to be very clear with our facts to answer the questions that I'm about to start. A 14-year-old girl presents requesting condoms. She has limited understanding of sexual health, cannot explain the risks of STIs, and appears confused when contraception is discussed. So clearly, she is not GILIC competent because she is not able to comprehend what is being told to her. There are no immediate safeguarding concerns. An 8-year-old girl is brought to emergency department with sudden onset severe lower abdominal pain, collapse and vomiting. On arrival, she is pale, hypotensive, tachycardic and has delayed capillary refill. Urgent ultrasound shows a ruptured ovarian cyst with significant intra-abdominal free fluid consistent with hemoperitoneum. Blood tests reveal a falling hemoglobin. The child is distressed and lacks capacity to consent. Her mother, who has parental responsibility, refuses consent for surgery due to personal beliefs. The father cannot be contacted. The pediatric gynecology and anesthetic teams agree that immediate surgery is required to save the child's life. The answer is I. Proceed with emergency surgery in the child's best interest. So, these are the scenarios which we frequently encounter, and it poses a very tricky situation for us, especially when the parent refuses a life saving treatment or an urgent treatment. As you can see in this question, the child clearly lacks capacity. The mother has parental responsibility, but parental refusal is not absolute. In life threatening emergencies where delay would risk harm or death, and there is no time to seek court authorization, clinicians are legally and ethically justified in proceeding without consent to act in child's best interest. The next question, a 29-year-old woman, gravida 2 para 1, admitted at 38 plus 2 weeks with placental abruption. She undergoes an emergency C-section. Intraoperatively, she develops postpartum hemorrhage with an estimated blood loss of 2.5 liters. Postoperatively, she's conscious, alert oriented, and able to communicate clearly. Her blood pressure is 95/60, pulse 120, and hemoglobin 6.2. She states she is Jehovah's Witness and refuses blood transfusion, repeating her refusal consistently. She demonstrates a clear understanding of the risk, includes the possibility of death, and confirms that her decision applies even in life-threatening situations. Her advanced decisions is also documented in her notes. The option is answer E. Patient has capacity, hence we have to respect patient refusal to treatment. In this question, the patient is an adult, has capacity, understands the nature, purpose, risks, and consequences of refusing blood, and has made a clear, consistent, and informed refusal. So, under the UK law and GMC RCOG guidance, a capacitous adult has absolute right to refuse medical treatment. This includes refusal to life-saving treatment as well. Her religious belief does not diminish her autonomy. Clinicians must therefore respect her refusal. Ideally, in a practical scenario like this, we offer her non-blood managements like iron infusions and discuss the options of fractions of primary components like albumin, immunoglobulin, clotting factors. They are often acceptable, but the discussion has to be made. But this is a personal decision. Recombinant products like human recombinant erythropoietin and clotting factors can also be discussed and given in Jehovah's Witness. A 20-year-old woman with a 5-year history of anorexia nervosa is reviewed in a gynecology medicine joint clinic. Her BMI is 12.5. She has secondary amenorrhea, osteopenia on DEXA scan, and intermittent postural dizziness. Blood tests show mild electrolyte abnormalities, but she is hemodynamically stable and not at immediate risk of collapse. The multidisciplinary team recommends structured nutritional rehabilitation and monitored refeeding to prevent progression to severe medical complication. She refuses treatment, stating that her weight is normal and the medical input is unnecessary. She is unable to acknowledge the risk of future infertility, osteoporosis, or organ damage, and dismisses these concerns as exaggerated. The team believes that without treatment, she is at high risk of serious long term harm. What is the most appropriate next step? The correct answer is J. Apply to Court of Protection to authorize treatment. Capacity is decision specific, not diagnosis specific. In anorexia nervosa, refusal to treatment may stem from a pathologically inability to recognize illness, indicating a lack of capacity. This patient cannot properly understand or weigh the long term risk of refusing treatment and therefore lacks capacity for this decision. Had she accepted that yes, she is willing to be osteoporotic, she understands the risk and she's refusing treatment despite understanding these risks and she knows that this will happen to her, then probably we would say she has capacity. But in this question, she just dismisses these as mere exaggerations. when refusal may lead to serious permanent harm, but the situation is not an emergency, the correct legal route is to seek authorization from the Court of Protection under the Mental Capacity Act. Please note this point because the questions can be very close to each other and the answers can vary depending on the clinical scenario provided. So please read each and every line of the question very carefully, and these answers can become very easy after that. A 78-year-old man with a moderate dementia is admitted to hospital with severe pneumonia. He lacks capacity to make decisions regarding his current medical treatment. On review of his medical record, it is noted that 2 years earlier, he had full mental capacity. He completed the DNA PCR, that is, do not attempt cardiopulmonary resuscitation form, stating he would not wish to receive a CPR in the event of a cardiac arrest. At the same time, he appointed his daughter as a lasting power of attorney for health and welfare. His daughter is now requesting that everything possible be done, including the CPR, if he deteriorates. So, in this question, we have to understand whether we accept the prior refusal that the patient has given for DNA CPR or whether we go by what the lasting power of attorney is saying. The correct answer is L. Follow DNA CPR decision as it represents a valid advance decision made with capacity. This is for all the questions regarding any gynecological scenarios or any obstetric scenarios that are present. If the patient has given any such advance directive and if she has a condition where she may lose capacity, she has capacity now, but she may lose capacity, or she has fluctuating capacity. If something has been stated with capacity and patient has consented for that, that has to be followed. This scenario tests knowledge of Mental Capacity Act 2005, advanced decisions, DNA CPR, and the legal hierarchy of decision making. The patient completed and signed the DNA CPR form at a time when he had full mental capacity. He also stated in advance that he would refuse CPR should such a situation arise. This constitutes a valid advance decision to refuse treatment under the Mental Capacity Act. Advance decisions made with capacity are legally binding. An advance decision for refusing life-sustaining treatment, including CPR, must be made when patient had capacity, specific to the treatment and circumstances, written, signed, and witnessed. These criteria are met in this case. Second, loss of capacity later due to dementia or any other medical or psychiatric conditions mentioned in the question, if you get that, does not invalidate a prior advance decision. Dementia is a progressive condition, but the law explicitly protects decisions made earlier when capacity existed. The patient's previously expressed autonomous wishes must therefore be respected. I am hoping that this session was very helpful to all of you. Please go through this video again to read the explanations because you may get new questions from these single pointers that I have mentioned as well. And I wish you all the best for your exam and your preparation, and wish you all the best and hope you pass with flying colors. Thank you so much for attending and watching my video.